Hi, I'm Jeet here. I'm National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation magazine. I also host the podcast, The Time of Monsters, which is sponsored by The Nation. I'm doing these YouTube videos on culture and politics. So today I want to talk about Paul Thomas Anderson's big new movie, One Battle After Another, which is already being talked about as the movie of the year, if not the movie of the decade. It premiered on Thursday, September 25th, and it is a movie about a group of revolutionaries that got crushed, and then years later get into another entanglement with their old foes in the federal government, leading to a clash in a city where anti-immigration policy and the war on drugs is used as a pretext for invading a city, as well as the pretext of domestic terrorism. And 2 days after the movie came out on Saturday, President Donald Trump put out a statement on Truth Social that they'll be sending in the military, which he authorized to use full force to the city of Portland to deal with the problem of Antifa. Uh, so the movie is extremely well timed. I mean, I think this is become a kind of cliche about it, how closely it echoes what's happening. Earlier this month, there had been a screening at the Directors Guild, and Steven Spielberg interviewed Paul Thomas Anderson at the screening, and Spielberg said that this is a movie that is so relevant and I think may have become increasingly more relevant than perhaps when you finished the screenplay and assembled your cast and crew and began production. I think that's certainly the case that the film it really does feel like it's mirroring things that are actually happening in America in terms of uh, uh, crackdowns on immigration, and clashes between the authority and popular resistance. But I'll get into the politics of the movie more broadly later. But I do want to actually say something first about the movie as a movie. I think it deserves all the praise that it's getting. Paul Thomas Anderson is a very accomplished filmmaker, but this is him working on a much larger scale with a much larger budget than he ever has before, doing something that I don't think he's ever really done before, which is a kinetic blockbuster. He's known as someone who admired James Cameron's Terminator 2, and the movie, has that feel to it of just that intense narrative drive. There's a car chase sequence at the end of the movie, which I think, does something remarkable, which is to make ring a new innovation in car chases. I think it's going to be seen as a classic. The movie, as is the norm for Paul Thomas Anderson, has an incredible cast, and it does have this narrative of the defeat of um, a rebellious group, the betrayals that come out of that, how they're dispersed, and then how this legacy echoes years later, is really given life by a stellar set of performances, led off by Leonardo DiCaprio as Ghetto Pat Calhoun. This. Who reinvents himself as Bob Ferguson when he goes into hiding. Um, a guy who had help make bombs for the group, the French 75. And his lover, Anna Taylor, is playing Perfidia Beverly Hills. Also, like a stunning performance. In some ways, a study of contrast. Character of Ghetto Pat Calhoun is a very much a sort of off boy, whereas Tiana Taylor as Perfidia is hard as steel, a really determined revolutionary, but who also gets entangled with uh, sexual desires that cross political lines, and uh, also issues of betrayal, which run throughout the movie. And their daughter, who's a product of their relationship, although there's some ambiguity in that, is also main leading character in the movie, played by Chase Infinity as Willa Ferguson, and she is the inheritor of this very mixed legacy of revolutionary agitation uh, and state repression, and they have to deal with the other side of the law, which is Sean Penn playing Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw, and again another terrific performance. Um, Lockjaw is, uh, a military type, a type that is all in for xenophobia and repression, and is very much entangled with, American white supremacy. But like many who are entangled with white supremacy, also has kind of desires that go against that stated ideology. And this is a real theme of the movie, how people on two sides of a divide actually have parallel or mirror each other and have certain connections that they might not themselves see. Um, and rounding out the cast, the other revolutionary figure from the past, Regina Hall as Desandra, a character who doesn't say much, but has sort of like hidden reserves of dignity, and is perhaps this witness to the sort of catastrophe of the story. So rounding out the cast is Benicio del Toro as Sensei Sergio St. Carlos, um, who is a ninja teacher to Willa Ferguson, but also much more. He's in his own way a kind of hidden revolutionary. Uh, Now, so movie like has all sorts of politics and character drama, but is really a movie that moves. Seat of your pant movie. When I was at the theater, the one person that got up to go to the washroom was very apologetic to everyone around her because she, like everyone else, was really engrossed in the movie. Like just as a pure cinematic kinetic experience, I can't recommend it highly enough. In terms of the sort of the politics of the movie, there's some issues that come up in partially in relationship to the source material. The Paul Thomas Anderson is a great admirer of the novelist Thomas Pynchon, and at the end of the movie, it says that the movie was inspired by Thomas Pynchon's novel Vineland. That's the case, but it is a very loose adaptation or a loose inspiration, and that's partially because like Pynchon novels are very hard to adapt. They're very literary novels, really dense prose, convoluted plots. Paul Thomas Anderson said he's a gigantic Pynchon fan, and I've long had this dance in my mind where I'd be thinking about doing Vineland or Mason and Dixon, but those would have been impossible tasks. So he recognizes the difficulty of adapting Pynchon. But this is like actually the third of his movies that is done in the spirit of Pynchon or has some Pynchon inflection. The Master from 20 really borrows a lot of thematic material and what the lead character from Pynchon's first novel, V, from 1963. The lead character of that novel, Benny Profane, is this kind of decommissioned sailor who's doesn't know what to do with his life, and that's very much the sort of main character of the Master. And then Paul Thomas Anderson went on to actually do a faithful adaptation of Pynchon's 2009 novel Inherent Vice. The movie came out in 2014. You can see the commonalities between Paul Thomas Anderson and Pynchon in this adaptation. Pynchon has lived on both the West and East Coast, but he has a series of California novels. With One Battle After Another and Vineland, there's a kind of core source material in the narrative, but there's a certain change. Vineland, novel from 1990, is really about the legacy of the 60s. The main characters are really all kind of refugees from the 60s, had been involved with this activism, but the novel is set in the 1980s when that past comes back to haunt them, and they have to deal with all the sort of political losses, retrenchment, compromises, and betrayals that have happened in the meantime. The main narrative of hippie stoner type who's raising a daughter who's the product of the 60s, along with a missing love partner who's been involved with betrayal. That's all in Vineland. Um, but the whole tone and um, but the timing in the novel or the periodization is different than the movie, and also the tone. The tone of Vineland is very regretful and wry. It was written during the Reagan era, and it reflects the Reagan era. It's basically about how America went from the 1960s to Reagan, and it has that, as one would expect, a mournful, what exactly has happened? How do we come to terms with this catastrophe? Now, one battle after another. Paul Thomas Anderson has been working on it for the last 20 years, but it's very much a product of a time where the political activism perhaps hasn't returned to the level of the 1960s, but is very much in the air again. The movie updates it, so the past story is set roughly. It's unnamed, but it feels it would have to be like 2008, 2009. And the present day is the eternal present of the movie. So let's say 2025. Now, where this becomes an issue is like in Vineland, the political agitation is modeled after the Weather Underground and the other 1960s radical groups, which engaged in sort of vanguardist adventurism and political violence. I mean, these are people who like robbed banks and blew up military depots. They actually didn't like there was like a very few people that got killed, but usually they called it in ahead of time. But there was like real political violence that was involved, and that wave of revolutionary violence done by revolutionary cell groups, flourished in the late 60s and 70s, but died away. And it really has not resurfaced. That this, political violence one sees, certainly on the left, and I think even on much of the right, is more decentralized and sort of lone wolf violence. But um, so the Vineland has basically a realistic sense of history, that there was this period of Weather Underground type political violence, and that has receded. But the law enforcement legacy is still there in the Reagan 80s. One battle after another, like, is basically positing this group, the French 75, which was operating in the late uh, George W. Bush, early Obama years, and was acting like the Weather Underground. So there's an anachronism there. No such group really existed. And furthermore, I think there's a kind of anachronism in the politics of the group, that the concerns of the French 75 are of contemporary politics. So abortion was an issue in the 60s and 70s, but it was done through the courts. Whereas the French 75 take a violent approach to going after right-wing lawmakers. And the other big issue is immigration, open borders, raiding ICE detention centers and liberating the people in those centers. So you have a group that's acting like the Weather Underground in 2008 with the certics of the left of 2025. So there's a whole series of anachronisms that are in the sort of conflation of the French 75. I mean, I don't actually have a problem with that myself. I think that the movie um, deals with uh, politics, political realities, but in a stylized way. I think it can be compared to a filmmaker that Paul Thomas Anderson knew and admired, Stanley Kubrick. In Doctor Strangelove, there's like real world political issues of nuclear war, but all the characters are these kind of like stylized caricatures. And there's something to that in One Battle After Another. The other thing I would say is the difference between Vineland and One Battle After Another is Vineland traces a historical loss and has a real textured feeling of history. One battle after another, and this is even in the title, one battle after another, is a sense that, like there's a constant struggle. And that, as one character says, 16 years had gone by, but nothing much had changed. So that's in some ways it's an inversion of the Thomas Pynchon point. It's not that, we had this period of agitation and it's died away. It's like we're always having these fights. And really, in one battle after another, as against Vineland, in the 60s have never died. They've gone underground. They're a current that flows through American life, and it's ready to spring up at different points. So I think that that's a kind of crucial difference. But I had a sort of exchange with this with the very good historian Malcolm Harris, who's written a lot about the history of California in the 60s and was a sort of fiction counterpart to Pynchon. And he takes I think, was a more historicist point of view, where it's just like, how could, and he hasn't actually seen the movie yet, but based on reviews of the movie, he was like asking, like, well, how can you have the Weather Underground in like 2008, 2009? How does that map out? But I actually think that as an artistic choice, it's not just that Paul Thomas Anderson took the raw material of the novel, and then because he updated it, it creates all this confusion. I actually think that it's artistically justified and it's narratively justified. And I think the justification is that it brings out a starker political contrast between different ways of doing resistance. So, on the one hand, you have the French 75, which is a vanguardist revolutionary cell doing adventurist politics. I mean, to spell that out, I mean, like, this is a little bit jargony, but this is the idea that politics is a small group of people are going to like incite a reaction and act out the revolution, and then people will follow. And I think that's a fair assessment of what the Weather Underground was up to. And there's a critique on the left. People like the Black Panther Party, they looked at the Weather Underground and said, these white guys, they're just engaged in adventurism. They're not prepared to do the sort of community building you need to do to resist oppression. And they're going to like do a lot of damage and get a lot of people hurt, which I think is true. So, it, so you have the French 75 revolutionary cell, vanguardist adventurism. The interesting thing is that that's contrasted with like another form of politics that we really see in the present day, in through the character of Sensei Sergio San Carlos, who's a Latino, lives in this community that's a sanctuary city, and at first seems like just a ninja teacher, who befriends the Leonardo DiCaprio character, Bob Ferguson, helps him, but actually, like, is a revolutionary in his own way, because he's actually running an underground railroad type operation, with its own form of tunnels, that is like helping migrants in the community. There's like all sorts of people in the community that basically are helping each other, and so there's this. I mean, if one wants to draw a contrast between vanguardist adventurism, one could say that this is communal self-help resistance. It's still a radical politics. I mean, the character Sensei Sergio San Carlos at one point says, we've been under siege for centuries, right? And he tells Bob Ferguson, go defensive, which is like, these are strategic decisions. The film really, the politics of the film, I think, is between the contrast between these two types of politics, to say that, there's a continuous struggle and it's the same forces. It is the forces of one hand, popular anti-racism, anti-capitalism, wanting to shake up the system, versus white supremacy, which is entrenched in plutocracy and militarism. That is the battle all along. But there's two different tactics or ways of posing it, and there's the failed past of the revolutionary vanguard party that engages in adventurism, and then there's this resistance that is more defensive, but is actually quite effective because it has the community on board, and it's people who like help each other evade these very dark and sinister forces. So I think that that's this broad politics of the movie, and I think this anachronism that some people are already critical of is actually defensible as a way, a stylization of reality that allows Paul Thomas Anderson to really make a greater contrast between these two types of politics. So I think that's what's going on. But to return to the what I said earlier, I mean I think this movie is important because it speaks to our time. It speaks to stuff that I write about all the time that we have to deal with. Uh, this issue of fascism, authoritarianism, what have you. But it is also a work of art, a work of considerable art. And I think, the question is going forward is just a good movie, or is it going to be, one of the all time classics? I think that it has very strong claims. The other thing I'll say about going back to the Pynchon stuff is that even as he's Paul Thomas Anderson is loose with the adaptation of Pynchon. In some ways, he captures the spirit of Pynchon, and this right wing cabal that the Sean Penn character Stephen J. Lockjaw tries to join. The Christmas Adventurers Club with their slogan of "Hail Saint Nick." Now, that's not in Vineland. But that feels very Pynchon. Like if you read that, there are always all these like very strange conspiratorial groups with their own weird rituals. And so I do actually think that even as in some ways the tone is different from Pynchon's Vineland, and in some ways maybe even the fundamental point is different, registering not historical change but historical continuity, still the spirit of Pynchon is there. And I mean, I think this all speaks to Paul Thomas Anderson's very considerable achievements as a filmmaker. That he's not just doing. I think he knows that adapting Pynchon is impossible, but he also realizes that you can still bring the life of Pynchon, bring all these issues and even this Pynchon type thinking into filmmaking, and that's also like very exciting. So as they say in the film world, two thumbs up. Go see this. You will not regret taking my advice on this one. So if you enjoyed what I said, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll have much more political and cultural commentary in the near future.